Rain hammered the narrow road outside Ashcombe village, and Eleanor Hartley ran through it without an umbrella, her skirts soaked to the knee. A man lay crumpled near the old stone bridge, one hand pressed against his ribs, his coat torn at the shoulder. She did not stop to think about who he was or where he had come from. She simply dropped to her knees beside him in the mud and asked if he could hear her voice. He opened his eyes slowly. He was younger than she expected, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. He tried to sit up and winced. "Don't move yet," she said firmly. "Tell me where it hurts." "My shoulder," he managed. "I fell from my horse. The animal bolted when the thunder struck." Eleanor helped him rise, draping his arm over her shoulder, despite his protests that he could manage alone. She half-carried him the quarter-mile back to her family's house, ignoring the ache building in her own arms, ignoring the rain that stung her eyes. When they reached the warm light of the kitchen door, she called for towels and hot water before she even asked his name. "Alaric Byrne," he said, still catching his breath. "I am a land assessor, traveling through the county for work." It was, of course, only half true. The name was invented. The occupation was a costume, no different from the plain gray coat he wore, instead of the fine tailored garments that hung in his wardrobe at Ashford Hall. He was, in truth, Alaric Whitmore, Duke of Ashford, and he had left his estate 3 days earlier with nothing but a borrowed horse and a plan that he had told no one, not even his own household staff. He had grown tired of drawing rooms filled with young women who fluttered their fans and recited compliments they clearly did not feel. He had grown tired of mothers who calculated his worth before they had learned his favorite color, his fears, or the sound of his own laughter. Every smile turned toward him in London felt rehearsed, every kind word measured against the size of his fortune. He wanted, just once, to be looked at as a man and not a title. So when he heard whispers in a tavern about a merchant's daughter in Ashcombe, a young woman known throughout the county for a gentleness that asked for nothing in return, he decided to see for himself. He would not announce himself as a duke. He would arrive as no one important at all, and he would watch how she treated a man who could offer her nothing. He had not expected to be thrown from his horse in the middle of a storm. He certainly had not expected to be carried into her home like an old friend returning after years away. Eleanor knelt before the fire, wringing out a cloth to press against his shoulder. Her father, Edmund Hartley, a stout man with kind eyes and a booming voice, stood in the doorway watching his daughter work. "You did not need to bring a stranger into our home, Eleanor," he said, though there was no real anger in his tone. He had seen his daughter do this before, and he had long since stopped trying to change her. He was hurt, father. What was I meant to do? Step over him and keep walking? Edmund shook his head, a small smile tugging at his mouth, and disappeared to fetch dry blankets. Alaric watched all of this with a strange tightness in his chest. She had not asked about his family name. She had not asked what he owned or where he had studied. She had asked only if he could feel his fingers, and whether the pain grew worse when he breathed deeply. "You are very kind to a man you do not know," he said quietly. Eleanor glanced up at him, surprised by the comment. Kindness should not depend on knowing someone first. If it did, it would hardly be kindness at all. It would only be a transaction. Her words settled into him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples that would not fade for a long while. He stayed the night in a small guest room above the stable, the storm rattling the shutters until the early hours of morning. He lay awake thinking of Eleanor's steady hands, the calm in her voice, the way she had not once flinched from the sight of blood on his shoulder. He had met countesses who would have fainted at far less. By morning the rain had stopped, and pale sunlight spilled across the fields. Alaric rose stiffly, testing his shoulder, and found Eleanor already awake, feeding chickens in the yard with a basket balanced on her hip. She wore a simple brown dress, her hair loosely braided, and she looked entirely unaware that she was being studied. "You are up early," he said, stepping out into the cool air. "The animals do not care what hour it is. They are hungry whether I am tired or not." He found himself smiling, an easy, unguarded smile that felt foreign on his own face. "May I help?" She raised an eyebrow. "A land assessor who wishes to feed chickens?" "A land assessor who owes his hostess a debt he cannot easily repay," he replied. She handed him a handful of grain without further argument, and for the next half hour, the Duke of Ashford scattered feed across a muddy yard beside a merchant's daughter, who had no idea she was speaking with the wealthiest man in 3 counties. It was during that quiet hour, watching her laugh when a rooster charged toward his boots, that Alaric made his decision. He would stay in the village a while longer. He had told himself the story about surveying land near the coast, and now he intended to make that story real enough to hold. He rented a small cottage from a widow at the edge of the village, close enough to walk to the Hartley home, And he began, without fully admitting it to himself, the quiet work of testing a young woman's heart. He did not yet know that his own heart would be the one most changed by what followed. That first week, he visited the Hartley household, under simple excuses. He asked Edmund Hartley questions about local property lines, scribbling notes in a leather book to maintain the appearance of his invented profession. He watched Eleanor from a careful distance, telling himself he was merely observing, though every evening he found some reason to linger past what was necessary. He noticed the way she greeted the baker's boy, a stuttering child who delivered bread twice a week, and always apologized for being early or late, never quite getting the timing right. Eleanor never rushed him. She thanked him by name, asked about his mother's cough, and once pressed a coin into his palm for nothing more than the effort of the walk. He noticed the way she spoke to Margaret, the elderly woman who helped with the household washing, treating her with the same respect she gave visiting merchants who arrived in fine carriages. There was no difference in her tone, no shift in her posture, no small unconscious signal that one person mattered more than another. Alaric had spent his whole life surrounded by people who calculated exactly how much warmth to offer, based on what they hoped to gain. Eleanor Hartley seemed incapable of such arithmetic. It unsettled him in a way he had not expected, because it meant his careful test was not truly testing anything false. It was only confirming what appeared, again and again, to be genuinely true. Still, he told himself he needed more proof. A person could be kind in comfortable moments. The real measure came when kindness cost something, when it demanded patience or sacrifice with no audience present to admire it. So he began, and carefully and without cruelty, to create small circumstances that might reveal her limits. One morning he arrived at the Hartley farm limping heavily, claiming he had twisted his ankle on the rocky path near the river. It was not true. He had practiced the limp the night before in the privacy of his rented cottage, feeling faintly ridiculous as he did so. Eleanor did not question him. She simply fetched a chair, insisted he sit, and knelt to examine his ankle with gentle hands, asking whether he could move his toes without pain. "It will heal in a day or two," he said, trying to draw the moment to a close before his conscience grew too heavy. "Even so, you should rest it properly. Wrapping it now will save you a week of limping later." And she wrapped his ankle with a strip of clean cloth, her fingers careful and sure, humming softly under her breath as she worked, as though caring for a stranger's injury was the most ordinary task in the world. He felt a flush of shame creep up his neck, not because she had discovered his deception, but because she had not. She trusted him completely, and he was repaying that trust with a lie about his own ankle. Later that same week, he arrived without any coin in his pocket, claiming his purse had been stolen on the road, and asked if he might borrow a small sum for a meal. Eleanor did not hesitate. She went to the small tin box her father kept for household expenses, and handed him several coins without a single question about how or when he intended to repay her. "Are you not worried I might disappear with your money?" he asked, half joking, half testing. "If you disappeared with a few coins meant to buy you bread, then you needed them more than we did," she said simply. "I would rather be foolish and kind than clever and cold." He gave the coins back to her the following day, claiming his own funds had been recovered, and she accepted them without comment, without suspicion, without the faintest hint that she believed she had been tested at all. Each small trial he arranged, she passed without effort, as though kindness required no calculation from her at all. It simply existed, quiet and constant, like breathing. There was, however, one afternoon that shook him more deeply than any of his careful arrangements. He was walking with her along the lane that bordered the Hartley property when they came upon a young farmhand named Peter, who worked the fields for a neighboring family. Peter had been caught, only moments before, taking apples from a tree that did not belong to him, apples meant to be sold at market the following week. The tree's owner, a sharp-tempered man named Walter Combs, had grabbed the boy by the collar, and was speaking loudly enough that birds scattered from the nearby hedges. "Thief," Walter said sharply. "I ought to have you sent away for this." Peter, no older than 14, stood frozen, his face pale, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. He did not defend himself. He simply stood there, shaking, as Walter's grip tightened on his collar. Eleanor stepped forward before Alaric could even decide what to do. "Mr. Combs," she said, her voice calm but carrying easily across the lane. "Please let him go. He was stealing from my orchard, Miss Hartley. This is not your business. I understand you are angry, and you have every right to be. But raising your voice at a frightened child will not return your apples, and it will not teach him anything except fear." Walter's face reddened further. "And what would you have me do instead? Thank him for his trouble?" "I would have you release his collar first," Eleanor said. Then perhaps we can speak like reasonable people instead of like a mob. There was something in her tone, steady and unafraid, that made Walter loosen his grip despite himself. Peter stumbled backward, rubbing his throat, still trembling. Eleanor turned to the boy directly. "Peter, why did you take the apples?" His voice cracked as he answered. "My mother is ill. We had no coin for the doctor, and no food besides bread. I thought if I sold a basket at market I could pay for medicine." Eleanor's expression softened, though she did not excuse what he had done. "Taking what belongs to another person is wrong, Peter, and you know that. If you had come to me, I would have found another way to help you, but I understand why fear made you desperate." She turned back to Walter. "Mr. Combs, I will pay for the apples he took, every one of them, and I will also see that his mother receives proper medicine this week. In exchange, I ask that you allow this matter to end here, without involving the constable, and without further shouting that will only frighten a child who already understands his mistake." Walter stared at her for a long moment, clearly unused to being addressed with such calm authority by a young woman half his age. Eventually, he grumbled his agreement, muttering something about soft hearts causing more trouble than they solved, though his anger had visibly drained away. Eleanor knelt before Peter, meeting his eyes directly. "You will work for Mr. Combs 3 afternoons a week, until the debt is repaid through labor, not through my coin alone. That way you learn the value of what was taken, and you keep your pride. Does that seem fair to you?" Peter nodded, still shaking, but something like relief had replaced the fear on his face. Alaric stood back through all of it, saying nothing, watching a young woman calm a moment that could easily have ended with a child dragged before a magistrate. She had shown no harshness toward the boy who had done wrong, and no weakness toward the man who had been wronged. She had simply found the narrow path between justice and mercy, and walked it without hesitation. That evening, walking back toward the village alone, Alaric found himself unable to stop thinking about the sound of her voice as she addressed Walter Combs. There had been no fear in it, no performance meant to impress an audience. She had acted the same whether anyone of importance was watching or not, because in her mind there was no difference between an important audience and no audience at all. He realized, with a discomfort he could not easily name, that his test had become something else entirely. He was no longer merely observing Eleanor Hartley to see if she deserved his trust. He was falling in love with a woman who did not yet know his true name. The realization unsettled him more than any storm or fall from a horse ever could. He wrote a letter that night to his estate, addressed to his most trusted household steward, a careful man named Simon who had served the Whitmore family for over 20 years. In it, Alaric explained only that his business in Ashcombe would extend longer than planned, and that any correspondence meant for the Duke of Ashford should be redirected quietly, without drawing attention to his location. He did not mention Eleanor by name. He was not yet ready to explain, even to himself, exactly what was happening in this quiet corner of the county. The following days passed in a strange, comfortable rhythm. Alaric helped with small tasks around the Hartley farm, mending a fence here, carrying water there, always careful to maintain the appearance of a humble traveler waiting for work related to his supposed profession. Edmund Hartley grew to like him, often inviting him to share supper at the family table, where conversation ranged from crop prices to old stories about Eleanor's childhood. It was during one such supper that Edmund mentioned, almost in passing, that his late wife had always said, "Eleanor's heart was too large for the size of the world." "She worries me sometimes," Edmund admitted, glancing fondly at his daughter across the table. "She would give away her last coin to a stranger and go hungry herself without a second thought." "That is not a flaw, father," Eleanor said, smiling. "That is simply how I choose to live." "It is not a flaw," Edmund agreed. "But it does mean the man who wins your hand one day will need a heart just as large, or he will never understand you at all." Alaric said nothing, though the words lodged themselves firmly in his chest, and he wondered, quietly and with growing unease, whether he possessed a heart large enough to match hers. 3 weeks into his stay in Ashcombe, a message arrived at the small cottage Alaric had rented, carried by a rider who had traveled 2 full days to find him. The letter bore the seal of Ashford Hall, and Alaric broke it open with hands that trembled slightly, fearing the worst before he had even read a single word. The letter was from Simon, his steward, and it explained that Lady Cecilia, Alaric's younger sister, had insisted on traveling to visit relatives near the coast, and had, against Simon's advice, decided to pass through Ashcombe on her route, wishing to surprise her brother after hearing rumors of his extended absence. Cecilia was headstrong in ways that often worried the household staff, and she had been deaf since a severe illness at the age of 6, a condition that had shaped much of her life, and much of how the world chose, unfairly, to treat her. Alaric felt a jolt of alarm. If Cecilia arrived and revealed his identity before he was ready, everything he had built with Eleanor over these past weeks could collapse in a single moment. He considered riding out immediately to intercept his sister before she reached the village, but the letter indicated she had already departed 2 days earlier, traveling with only a single companion and a modest carriage, preferring simplicity over the grand procession that usually accompanied members of noble households. He spent that night pacing the small cottage, torn between two fears that felt equally heavy. He feared losing Eleanor's trust if his secret unraveled too soon. But he also feared, more quietly and more deeply, what might happen if Cecilia arrived at an unfamiliar village and found no one willing to understand her, no one patient enough to look past the silence that surrounded her and see the clever, warm young woman underneath. Cecilia had grown accustomed to a particular kind of cruelty over the years, not always intended as cruelty by those who delivered it, but painful all the same. Strangers often spoke slowly and loudly around her, as though volume alone might restore what illness had taken. Others avoided her gaze entirely, uncertain how to address someone who could not hear their words, and so they simply stopped trying. Still others treated her with an exaggerated performative sympathy that made her feel less like a person and more like an object of pity to be managed, rather than a woman to be known. Alaric had watched his sister endure this treatment throughout their childhood and into adulthood, watched her grow quieter in public settings not because she lacked things to say, but because she had learned that saying them rarely changed how people responded. She communicated fluently through sign language, taught to her by a patient tutor their late mother had hired when Cecilia was still a child, and she read lips with remarkable skill when given the chance to watch a speaker's face clearly. But skill alone could not force a frightened or awkward stranger to make the effort required to understand her. The following afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in from the western hills, darkening the sky with startling speed. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, and the temperature dropped sharply enough that Eleanor, working in the garden behind her family home, hurried to gather the last of the drying linens before they were soaked through entirely. It was in the middle of this scramble that a modest carriage rounded the bend in the road, its wheels splashing through puddles that had formed within minutes. The carriage stopped abruptly near the Hartley gate, and a young woman stepped down, her traveling cloak already darkening with rain, her expression tight with the particular discomfort of someone far from home, and uncertain where safety might be found. Eleanor abandoned the linens entirely, and ran toward the gate, waving the stranger toward the house. "Come inside, quickly, before you catch a chill." The young woman did not respond, did not turn her head toward the sound of Eleanor's voice at all, and continued walking toward the house with the careful, watchful posture of someone reading her surroundings through sight rather than sound. It took Eleanor only a moment to understand. She fell into step beside the stranger, no longer calling out, and instead placed a light hand on her arm to draw her attention, waiting until the young woman turned to face her fully before speaking again, slowly and clearly, her lips forming each word with care. "Please come inside, it is warm by the fire." The young woman studied Eleanor's mouth carefully, then nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her rain-streaked face. Once inside, Eleanor guided her to a chair near the hearth and knelt to help remove her soaked cloak, all without a hint of hesitation or discomfort, as though welcoming unexpected guests unable to hear was simply another ordinary part of her day. She fetched a dry blanket, wrapped it around the stranger's shoulders, and then paused, considering how best to continue. Eleanor had never learned formal sign language, but she had once spent several months caring for an elderly neighbor who had lost her hearing late in life, and during that time, Eleanor had picked up small gestures, simple signs for basic needs, and above all, the patience required to communicate without relying solely on spoken words. She raised her hands and offered a simple sign for warm, then pointed toward the fire, then made a gesture asking, with raised eyebrows and an open palm, whether the young woman was hurt or unwell. The stranger's eyes widened with surprise, then softened into something like gratitude. She shook her head to indicate she was not hurt, then pressed her palm to her chest and inclined her head slightly, a simple gesture of thanks that needed no words at all. Eleanor smiled warmly and fetched a small slate and chalk that her father kept near the kitchen for tallying accounts, offering it to the young woman so they might write to one another more easily. The stranger took the chalk gratefully and wrote a single word, "Cecilia." Eleanor took the chalk in turn and wrote her own name below it, then added a short line beneath both names. "You are safe here. Rest as long as you need." Cecilia read the words carefully, her shoulders visibly loosening for the first time since she had stepped down from the carriage, and she offered Eleanor a small, genuine smile, the kind of smile that comes only after a long stretch of tension finally breaks. They spent the next hour by the fire, passing the slate back and forth, Eleanor asking simple questions about where Cecilia had traveled from, and whether her companion outside needed shelter as well. Eleanor quickly sent word for the carriage driver to bring the horses into the barn and to join them inside once the animals were settled, refusing to let anyone remain out in the storm a moment longer than necessary. At one point, Cecilia wrote a longer message on the slate, her chalk moving with practiced speed. Most people speak louder when they learn I cannot hear, as though volume might somehow reach me. You did not do that. You simply waited until I could see your face, and you spoke clearly instead. Thank you. Eleanor read the words twice, feeling a small ache in her chest at the quiet weight behind them. She took the chalk and wrote back. Shouting would not help you understand me any better. It would only make you feel as though something was wrong with you, when nothing is wrong at all. I simply needed to find the way that worked for us both. Cecilia's eyes glistened slightly as she read this, and she reached out to squeeze Eleanor's hand briefly, before continuing their conversation, this time asking, through careful writing, about the village itself, and how long Eleanor had lived there. Edmund Hartley returned from the field sometime later, soaked through from the rain, and found his daughter and a stranger seated comfortably by the fire, passing a slate back and forth with the easy familiarity of old friends, rather than two people who had met only hours earlier. He greeted Cecilia with a respectful nod once Eleanor explained, briefly, the nature of her hearing, and he made certain to face her directly whenever he spoke, following his daughter's example without needing further instruction. It was well into the evening, the storm finally beginning to soften into a gentle drizzle, when a familiar figure appeared at the Hartley door, his gray coat soaked through, his hair dripping, his expression caught somewhere between relief and dread. Alaric had ridden through the worst of the storm once he learned from a village boy that a carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest had stopped near the Hartley farm. He had feared the worst, imagining his sister stranded and frightened among strangers who did not know how to help her. Instead, he stepped through the door and found Cecilia laughing softly, her cheeks flushed with warmth from the fire. A slate covered in shared writing balanced on her knee, seated comfortably beside Eleanor as though they had known one another for years. Cecilia looked up first, and her face lit with genuine delight at the sight of her brother. She rose quickly and crossed the room to embrace him, signing rapid questions with her hands that he answered just as quickly, his own fingers moving with the fluent ease of someone who had learned sign language alongside his sister since childhood, determined that illness would never be allowed to separate them. Eleanor watched this exchange with quiet curiosity, noticing how naturally Alaric Byrne communicated with his sister, how his hands moved without hesitation, how his eyes stayed fixed on her face throughout their entire conversation. It was clear this was not the first time he had spoken this way, not a skill hastily assembled for the occasion, but a language he had carried with him for years. You know each other, Eleanor said softly, once their hands finally stilled. Cecilia turned to Eleanor and reached for the slate again, writing quickly. He is my brother. I came to surprise him, though it seems the storm surprised me instead. Eleanor glanced toward Alaric, a small furrow forming between her brows, though nothing in her expression suggested suspicion yet, only the natural curiosity of learning something new about a man she had spent weeks growing to know. Your sister traveled a long way to find you. She rarely listens to good advice about staying home during storms, Alaric said, attempting lightness though his voice carried an unmistakable strain. Cecilia, watching his lips carefully, laughed, and signed something quick and teasing toward her brother, which he translated for Eleanor with a faint, embarrassed smile. She says I have always been the one who worries too much, and that I should learn to trust that she can manage herself. Eleanor smiled at this, charmed despite the odd tension she could not quite name, gathering in the corners of the room. The evening continued warmly enough, supper shared around the Hartley table, Cecilia and Eleanor continuing their easy conversation through writing and simple signs, Edmund telling old stories that made Cecilia laugh silently, her shoulders shaking with genuine amusement. Alaric sat mostly quiet throughout the meal, watching the woman he loved treat his sister with the same effortless warmth she offered everyone else, and feeling, with each passing minute, the walls of his careful disguise beginning to crack under the weight of his own guilt. He knew, with growing certainty, that the truth could not remain hidden much longer. Cecilia knew his real name. She had grown up hearing servants and townspeople alike address her brother as Your Grace, and though she had been careful throughout supper to use only the name Alaric aloud and in her signing, one careless slip, one unguarded moment, could unravel everything he had built with Eleanor these past weeks. That night, after Cecilia and her companion had settled into the modest guest quarters the Hartleys offered for the storm's remaining hours, Alaric walked with his sister briefly in the covered porch outside, the rain now reduced to a soft patter against the roof. Cecilia signed to him directly, her expression serious despite the gentle rhythm of her hands. You have not told her who you truly are. No, Alaric admitted, his own hands moving in response, the silent language passing between them with practiced ease. I wanted to know if she could care for someone with nothing to offer her. I did not expect to fall in love with the answer. Cecilia's expression softened, though a note of concern remained in her eyes. She deserves the truth soon, brother, not because you owe her an explanation, but because she has already given you honesty without asking for anything in return. It is not fair to keep taking that from her while giving nothing true of yourself back. Alaric nodded slowly, the weight of his sister's words settling heavily against the growing dread already lodged in his chest. He knew she was right. He had known it for days, perhaps weeks, and had simply been searching for the courage to face what came next. I will tell her, he signed back. Soon. I only need to find the right moment. Cecilia studied him for a long moment, then reached out and squeezed his hand once, a small gesture of both comfort and warning. There may not be a right moment, brother. Sometimes the truth simply has to be spoken before the moment feels ready at all. She left him standing alone on the porch, the rain finally beginning to fade into silence, the weight of an approaching reckoning settling over him like the last damp chill of the storm. Morning arrived with a washed, clean sky, the storm having scrubbed the air until it smelled of wet earth and new grass. Cecilia rose early, intending to help Eleanor with breakfast before her carriage continued its journey toward the coast, and it was during this quiet hour, the two women alone in the kitchen, that the truth finally slipped free, not through malice or intention, but through simple habit. Eleanor had asked, through careful writing on the small slate, whether Cecilia's family lived far from Ashcombe, curious about the life her new friend led beyond this single storm-bound evening. Cecilia wrote back easily, her chalk moving without hesitation, accustomed to answering such questions honestly among the few people who took the time to ask them properly. Our estate lies 2 days' ride from here, near the northern hills. My brother manages it, along with several other properties left to him by our father. Eleanor smiled, imagining a modest farm not unlike her own family's land. What sort of properties does he manage? Cecilia, still thinking only of easy morning conversation and not of any secret she might be breaking, wrote her answer without a second thought. Ashford Hall, mostly, along with the tenant farms across 3 counties. It has been a great deal of responsibility for him since father passed, though he rarely complains of it. Eleanor's hand paused over the slate, her chalk hovering without touching the surface. Ashford Hall. She had heard that name before, spoken with a kind of hushed reverence by traveling merchants who passed through Ashcombe on their way to larger markets. Ashford Hall belonged to the Duke of Ashford, one of the wealthiest and most influential noblemen in the region, a man whose name appeared in London papers that occasionally found their way to the village, always accompanied by descriptions of grand balls and important political gatherings. Your brother manages Ashford Hall, Eleanor said aloud, slowly, watching Cecilia's face carefully as she spoke. Cecilia, reading her lips, nodded easily, still unaware of the growing confusion forming behind Eleanor's eyes. He does more than manage it. He is the Duke of Ashford himself, though he rarely enjoys being addressed by the title among people he trusts. The room seemed to tilt slightly around Eleanor, the warm morning light suddenly feeling harsh and exposing rather than comforting. She set down the chalk carefully, her fingers trembling just slightly, and forced her voice to remain steady. Your brother is Alaric Byrne, the land assessor who has been staying near our village these past weeks. Cecilia's expression shifted then, understanding dawning slowly as she realized, too late, exactly what she had revealed. She reached for the slate quickly, writing with urgent, hurried strokes. He asked me not to speak of this. Please, Eleanor, let him explain it himself. I did not mean to break his trust. But Eleanor was already rising from her chair, her mind racing back through every conversation of the past weeks, every small test she had not recognized as a test at all. Every moment she had believed herself simply helping a humble traveler who needed her kindness. The twisted ankle that healed suspiciously fast, the stolen purse that reappeared within a single day, the careful questions about her family, her habits, her opinions on wealth and poverty, and how people ought to treat one another. He had been studying her, measuring her, deciding, quietly and secretly, whether she was worthy of something she had not even known was being offered. She walked out of the kitchen without another word, ignoring Cecilia's urgent gestures asking her to wait, and found her father in the yard, informing him briefly that she needed air before the day's chores began. Edmund, sensing something troubled in his daughter's expression, did not press her further, though his eyes followed her with quiet concern as she walked toward the low stone wall at the edge of their property, the same wall where she often sat when she needed to untangle difficult thoughts. She had not been sitting there long when she heard footsteps approaching. familiar and hesitant, and she did not need to turn around to know who it was. "Eleanor," Alaric said quietly, stopping several paces away, giving her the space she clearly needed. "Cecilia told me what happened. I owe you the truth, and I should have given it to you weeks ago." "Yes," Eleanor said, still facing the fields ahead of her, her voice tight and controlled. "You should have." He stepped closer, though he stopped again when her shoulders stiffened at his approach. "My name is Alaric Whitmore. I am the Duke of Ashford. I came to Ashcombe under a false name because I wanted to find someone who could care for me without knowing what I could offer them in return. I have spent years surrounded by people who valued my title more than my character, and I wanted, just once, to know what it felt like to be loved honestly." "And did you find your answer?" Eleanor asked, finally turning to face him, her eyes bright with a mixture of hurt and anger that made his chest ache. "Was I a satisfactory subject for your experiment, Your Grace?" The title landed between them like a slap, and Alaric flinched visibly. "Please do not call me that. Not you." "Why not?" "It is your true name, is it not? The one you hid from me while I nursed your fabricated injuries and lent you coins for a poverty you never truly suffered." Her voice grew sharper with each word, though tears gathered at the corners of her eyes despite her efforts to hold them back. "You watched me, Alaric, or whatever I should call you now. You created situations meant to reveal my character, as though I were livestock being examined before a purchase. That is not what this was," Alaric said, his own voice cracking with the effort of controlling his emotion. "I never intended to hurt you. I only wanted to know the truth of your heart before I risked my own." "And what of my heart?" Eleanor demanded, her voice rising now, though the ache beneath the anger was unmistakable. "Did it not occur to you that I might have feelings too? Feelings that grew over these past weeks, believing I was coming to know a humble traveler with nothing to hide. You let me believe a lie, and worse, you let me fall for that lie without ever giving me the chance to choose whether I wanted to fall for the truth instead." Alaric had no answer for this, because she was right, and he knew it completely. He had spent so many weeks focused on protecting his own heart from further disappointment that he had never fully considered how his deception might wound the very person he was trying to understand. "I am sorry," he said finally, the words feeling insufficient against the weight of what he had done. "I never meant for this to become something that could hurt you. I only meant to protect myself, and somewhere along the way, protecting myself became far less important than knowing you." Eleanor wiped angrily at her eyes, refusing to let the tears fall freely in front of him. "You should leave, Alaric. I need time to understand what these past weeks truly were, and I cannot do that with you standing here trying to explain your way out of the hurt you caused." He nodded slowly, accepting the request, though every part of him wanted to stay and continue arguing his case. "I will go, but please know that everything I felt watching you these past weeks was real, even if the name I gave you was not." He turned and walked back toward the village, his shoulders heavy with a regret that settled deep into his bones, leaving Eleanor alone at the stone wall, with a storm of confusion churning inside her chest far more turbulent than the one that had passed through Ashcombe the day before. Cecilia found her there a short while later, having convinced her carriage driver to delay their departure by another day. She approached carefully, waiting until Eleanor noticed her presence before sitting beside her on the low wall, offering the slate once more. "I am sorry I broke his confidence without meaning to, but perhaps it needed to break, one way or another. He has been carrying this secret like a stone around his neck for weeks. I have watched it weigh on him more each day." Eleanor read the words silently, then looked up at Cecilia, studying her face carefully. "Did he tell you why he chose this village? Why he chose to test me specifically?" Cecilia considered the question, then wrote her answer thoughtfully. He heard stories of a young woman known for kindness that asked for nothing in return. He wanted to know if such kindness could exist without calculation. "I believe, watching you these past 2 days, that he found his answer clearly enough. What troubles me is that he found the answer through deception rather than honesty. He should have simply asked me who I was, and let me answer honestly, without hiding who he was in return," Eleanor said, her voice softer now, some of the sharp anger fading into a quieter, more complicated sadness. Cecilia nodded in agreement, then added something further to the slate. "My brother has been wounded many times by people who wanted only his title and his wealth. I do not say this to excuse what he did, only to help you understand why he felt he needed to do it. He is not a cruel man, Eleanor. He is a frightened one, though he would never use that word to describe himself." Eleanor read this slowly, feeling some of her anger soften into something closer to understanding, though the hurt beneath it remained sharp and present. "That does not undo what he did." "No," Cecilia agreed. But perhaps it explains it enough to leave room for forgiveness when you are ready to consider it. I have watched you treat me with more genuine warmth in 2 days than most people manage in years. If my brother has any sense at all, and I believe he does, he knows exactly what he risks losing by earning your anger instead of your trust." The two women sat together for a while longer, saying little else, the morning sun climbing slowly overhead, warming the damp fields that stretched out before them, while somewhere in the village, Alaric Whitmore sat alone in his rented cottage, wondering whether he had finally lost, through his own foolish caution, the very thing he had traveled so far and hidden so carefully to find. 3 days passed without a single word between them. Alaric remained in his rented cottage, unable to bring himself to leave Ashcombe entirely, though he no longer visited the Hartley farm, respecting the distance Eleanor had asked for even as it tore at him more with each passing hour. He spent those days writing letters he never sent, each one an attempt to explain himself more clearly than he had managed at the stone wall, each one discarded into the small fireplace as insufficient. Cecilia had extended her stay in the village beyond her original plans, quietly settling into a small room at the local inn, rather than continuing her journey toward the coast. She visited Eleanor daily, their friendship deepening despite the shadow that hung over the circumstances of their meeting, and through these visits, Eleanor slowly came to understand more about the man who had lied to her, not through his own words but through the stories his sister shared. She learned of a childhood marked by a father who measured his children's worth through achievement and appearance, a mother who had died when Alaric was barely 15, leaving him to grow into responsibilities far beyond his years, while still grieving a loss he had never been given time to properly mourn. She learned of the years following his father's death, when Alaric had been thrust into managing an entire dukedom while barely into adulthood himself, surrounded suddenly by advisors and suitors and distant relatives who suddenly remembered his existence once his title carried real weight. She learned, too, of the particular cruelty Cecilia herself had faced throughout her life, and how fiercely Alaric had always defended his sister against those who dismissed her intelligence simply because she could not hear their voices. It was Alaric who had insisted Cecilia receive proper education in sign language despite objections from relatives who believed such efforts were wasted on a girl who would never fully participate in society. It was Alaric who had quietly ended friendships and business arrangements with men who spoke about his sister with condescension, regardless of what such choices cost him politically. This was not a portrait of a cruel man, Eleanor realized slowly, turning these stories over in her mind during the quiet hours of each evening. This was a portrait of a man so wounded by dishonesty in his own life that he had built an elaborate test to protect himself from experiencing it again, never fully considering that his test might wound the very honesty he was trying to find. On the 4th day, Eleanor walked to the village on her own, without informing her father of her destination, and found herself standing outside the small cottage where Alaric had been staying throughout his weeks in Ashcombe. She knocked before she could talk herself out of the decision, and a long moment passed before the door opened. Alaric looked as though he had slept poorly for several nights running, his eyes shadowed, his usually composed bearing softened into something rawer and more uncertain. He stared at her for a moment as though uncertain whether she was truly standing before him, or merely a hopeful imagining conjured from his own exhausted mind. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice rough, "I did not expect you." "I did not expect to come," she admitted. "May I speak with you?" He stepped aside immediately, ushering her into the modest cottage, offering her the single comfortable chair, while he remained standing, too anxious to sit still. She did not take the seat, choosing instead to stand near the small window, gathering her thoughts before beginning. "I have spent these past days speaking with your sister," she said, "not seeking gossip but trying to understand what kind of man would do what you did. I learned things about your childhood, about the losses you carried, about the way people have treated you and your sister throughout your lives. It does not erase what you did to me, Alaric, but it helps me understand why you might have felt driven to do it. I never wanted to hurt you," he said again, the same words he had offered at the stone wall, though this time his voice carried a steadier conviction. "I have turned this over endlessly these past days, and I keep arriving at the same understanding. I was so afraid of being loved for the wrong reasons that I built a wall of deception around myself, and in doing so, I denied you the very honesty I claimed to be searching for in others. That is not fair to you, and I am deeply sorry for it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the ache that still lingered in her chest. "You watched me care for a stranger you invented, tend wounds that were never real, offer coins for a poverty that did not exist. Every kindness I showed you these past weeks, I believed I was offering to someone with nothing, someone who needed help simply because he was a fellow human being deserving of care. Instead, I was performing for an audience I did not know was judging me. You were never performing, Alaric said quietly. That is precisely what struck me most deeply, Eleanor. You never once behaved differently whether you believed yourself watched or unwatched. The way you treated Peter when he stole those apples, the way you welcomed Cecilia into your home without a moment's hesitation, none of that was performance. It was simply who you are, consistently, without calculation. I did not create a test that revealed a false kindness in you. I created a test that revealed a true one. And somewhere in the process of watching that truth unfold, I lost my own heart to it entirely. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. Then why could you not simply trust that truth from the beginning, without needing to deceive me first? Because I did not yet know you, he said simply. And because every person I had trusted before you had eventually shown me that their kindness came with conditions I had not seen until it was too late. I am not asking you to forgive the method, Eleanor. I am only asking you to believe that everything I felt watching you, every moment of admiration, every quiet realization that you were unlike anyone I had known, all of that was entirely real, regardless of the false name I carried while feeling it. The cottage grew quiet between them, the only sound the soft crackle of the small fire in the hearth and the distant call of birds outside the window. Eleanor wiped at her eyes, considering his words carefully, feeling the last of her anger settle into something more complicated, something that still ached but no longer burned quite so fiercely. I need you to understand something, she said finally. I do not care about your title, Alaric. I never once cared whether you were a duke or a farmhand or a traveling assessor of land you do not actually assess. What hurt me was not learning that you were wealthy or powerful. What hurt me was learning that you did not trust me enough to simply be honest from the very beginning. I know, he said, and I promise you, from this moment forward, there will be no more hidden names, no more invented injuries, no more tests disguised as chance encounters. If you are willing to give me the chance, I will spend as long as it takes proving that the trust you deserve is trust I am prepared to earn honestly, without deception standing between us ever again. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying his face, searching for any remaining trace of calculation or performance, and finding instead only a raw, unguarded sincerity that matched the vulnerability she had glimpsed so often during their weeks together, back when she believed him nothing more than a humble traveler passing through her quiet corner of the world. I am still hurt, she admitted softly. That has not disappeared simply because I understand your reasons better now. I do not expect it to disappear so quickly, Alaric said. I only hope you might allow me the chance to earn back what my deception cost us both. Eleanor considered this for a long moment, then took a slow breath and nodded. I am willing to try. But slowly, Alaric. Trust rebuilt in haste is trust rebuilt poorly. Relief flooded his features, though he did not reach for her, respecting the careful boundary she had drawn even as hope rekindled cautiously in his chest. Slowly then, however long you need. Over the following weeks, Alaric remained in Ashcombe, though he no longer hid behind the name of Alaric Byrne. He informed the Hartley family of his true identity, and though Edmund Hartley was initially startled to learn he had been sharing his supper table with the Duke of Ashford, his fondness for the man he had come to know outweighed any lingering unease about rank or title. Alaric insisted on continuing to help with the small tasks around the farm, mending fences and carrying water just as he had before, unwilling to let his true identity change the honest, simple friendship he had built with Eleanor's family. Slowly, carefully, the trust between Eleanor and Alaric began to rebuild, not through grand gestures or extravagant gifts, but through small, consistent honesty. He told her stories of his childhood without softening the uncomfortable parts. He asked her opinion on matters concerning his estate, and genuinely considered her answers rather than simply seeking her approval. He brought Cecilia to visit often, and the friendship between the two women deepened into something Eleanor treasured deeply, a bond built entirely on patience and genuine effort rather than convenience. It was nearly 2 months after the truth had first come to light that Alaric asked Eleanor to walk with him along the same lane where Peter had once stood trembling before Walter Combs, the same lane where Eleanor had first shown Alaric the quiet courage that lived beneath her gentle nature. The autumn air had turned crisp, the leaves along the hedges shifting into shades of gold and deep amber, and Cecilia walked a short distance behind them, smiling quietly to herself as she watched the two people she loved most in the world finally finding their way back to one another. Alaric stopped near the old stone bridge where he had once lain injured in the rain, waiting for a stranger's kindness he had not expected to receive so freely. "This is where it began," he said, "though not truly, I suppose. It began the moment you knelt beside me without asking who I was or what I could offer you in return." Eleanor smiled softly, memory softening the lines of tension that had once lived permanently between her brows during those difficult weeks of rebuilding. "I remember thinking you were remarkably clumsy for a land assessor," he laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that had grown more frequent in the weeks since his deception had ended. "I have never claimed to be skilled on horseback." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small ring, simple in design, free of the ostentatious jewels that might have suited his true rank, chosen instead because it reminded him of the plain, honest life he had briefly lived in Ashcombe, a life he had come to value more deeply than any grandeur waiting for him back at Ashford Hall. "Eleanor Hartley," he said, kneeling on the damp grass beside the bridge. "I came to this village wearing a false name, searching for proof that kindness could exist without calculation. I found far more than proof. I found a woman whose heart is larger than any title I could ever claim, and I would be honored, beyond anything I have known in my life, if you would agree to share that heart with mine, honestly, for the rest of our days." Eleanor felt tears gathering, though this time they carried none of the sharp hurt from weeks before, only a quiet, overwhelming joy that had been slowly building since the moment she first chose to walk back into his cottage and offer him a second chance. "Yes," she said softly, "though I must warn you, Your Grace, that I intend to keep testing your honesty for the rest of our lives, whether you expect it or not." He laughed again, sliding the ring gently onto her finger, before rising to embrace her fully, the autumn wind carrying the sound of Cecilia's delighted, silent laughter as she watched from a respectful distance, her hands rising instinctively to sign a simple, joyful message toward the sky, a message meant for no one in particular, except the quiet satisfaction of watching two people finally find their way toward a love built on honesty rather than deception. Behind them, the village of Ashcombe continued its quiet, ordinary rhythm, unaware that within its modest borders, a duke had learned the true measure of a kind heart, and a merchant's daughter had discovered that love, however complicated its beginning, could still grow into something lasting when both people finally chose honesty over fear. The wedding took place the following spring, not at Ashford Hall as many of the noble families expected, but in the small stone chapel at the edge of Ashcombe, the same village where Eleanor had spent her entire life, and where Alaric had first learned what it meant to be loved without condition. Eleanor had insisted on this choice, and Alaric, true to the promise he had made beside the old stone bridge, agreed without hesitation, understanding that honoring her roots mattered far more than impressing distant relatives who had shown little genuine interest in his life, until his title made their attention worthwhile. The chapel filled with an unusual mixture of guests that spring morning, farmers and shepherds seated alongside distant cousins of noble blood, Margaret the washerwoman sharing a pew with a viscount who had traveled from London out of curiosity, more than genuine affection. Peter, now a year older and steadier on his feet, stood near the back with his mother, fully recovered thanks to the medicine Eleanor had arranged that stormy season, both of them beaming with a gratitude that had never faded. Cecilia stood at the front beside her brother, serving as his closest attendant, her hands moving throughout the ceremony to translate the vows for the benefit of several guests unfamiliar with formal wedding language, though in truth, she needed no translation herself, having read every word from Alaric's lips with the practiced ease of a lifetime spent watching those she loved most closely. Edmund Hartley walked his daughter down the narrow aisle with tears he made no effort to hide, whispering to her as they walked that her late mother would have been proud beyond words to see the woman she had become, a woman whose heart had proven, in the end, far too large for any single village to contain. After the ceremony, the celebration continued long into the evening, spilling from the chapel gardens into the village square itself, where long tables groaned under the weight of food prepared not by hired staff from Ashford Hall, but by neighbors and friends who had known Eleanor since childhood, and wished to mark her happiness with their own hands. Alaric insisted that his household staff join the festivities as guests rather than servants for the evening, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the changes his months in Ashcombe had worked upon him. Simon, his loyal steward, approached the newly married couple sometime during the evening, offering a formal bow before allowing himself a rare, genuine smile. "Your father would hardly recognize you, Your Grace, dancing barefoot in a village square surrounded by farmers and shepherds. My father valued the wrong things," Alaric replied simply, glancing toward Eleanor, who laughed freely, as Cecilia attempted to teach her a simple folk dance popular among the village children. "I intend to spend the rest of my life valuing better ones." The following months brought significant changes to Ashford Hall itself, changes that rippled outward through the surrounding counties in ways few had anticipated. Eleanor, now Duchess of Ashford, refused to abandon the habits that had defined her throughout her life. She continued visiting tenant families personally, rather than relying solely on stewards to report their needs, insisting on hearing directly from struggling farmers about failed harvests or illness within their households. She established a small fund, modest at first, dedicated to providing medical care for families across the estate who could not otherwise afford a physician, remembering always the fear she had once seen in young Peter's eyes when his mother's illness had driven him toward desperate choices. Cecilia moved permanently into a comfortable set of rooms at Ashford Hall, no longer treated as a fragile relative to be managed quietly out of sight during important gatherings, but embraced fully as a vital member of the household. Eleanor insisted that sign language be taught to every member of the staff who wished to learn it, transforming what had once been a source of isolation for Cecilia into a shared language that connected her more deeply with the household she called home. Within a year, Cecilia had become known throughout the county, not as the Duke's unfortunate sister, but as a sharp, capable woman who managed much of the estate's charitable efforts with remarkable skill. It was during this same year that Cecilia herself found unexpected companionship in a visiting physician named Edward Lowry, a quiet, thoughtful man who had traveled to Ashford Hall to help establish the medical fund Eleanor had championed. Edward had learned basic sign language years earlier while studying medicine in a coastal city known for its work with deaf patients, and his patience and genuine interest in Cecilia's opinions on estate matters slowly grew into something neither of them had expected to find. Alaric watched this budding friendship with quiet satisfaction, remembering his own fierce protectiveness over his sister throughout the years and feeling, for the first time, that he might finally trust someone else to understand her as completely as he did. Walter Combs, the sharp-tempered orchard owner who had once grabbed young Peter by the collar, found himself an unlikely beneficiary of the changes sweeping through the county. Eleanor, remembering the tension of that afternoon along the lane, made a point of visiting his orchard personally each autumn, purchasing apples for the estate's kitchens, and speaking with him about his crops with the same genuine interest she showed every tenant. Over time, Walter's gruff exterior softened considerably, and he became, somewhat to his own surprise, one of the estate's most vocal defenders, whenever visiting nobility questioned why the Duchess of Ashford insisted on personally knowing every farmer within her husband's lands. Peter, now approaching his 16th year, was offered a position as an apprentice groundskeeper at Ashford Hall, an opportunity that allowed him to learn a respectable trade while continuing to support his mother, whose health had steadily improved thanks to the medical fund Eleanor had established. He often told the story of the apples he had once stolen out of desperation, using it as a reminder to younger village children that mistakes made from fear could still lead toward better paths when met with understanding rather than punishment alone. Alaric, for his part, found himself transformed by the honesty he had once feared so deeply. He began attending council meetings among the county's noble families with a new perspective, often surprising his peers by insisting that tenant concerns be heard directly rather than filtered through layers of stewards and clerks who might soften uncomfortable truths before they ever reached the ears of those with power to address them. Some among the nobility grumbled about the Duke of Ashford growing soft, more concerned with common farmers than with matters befitting his rank, but Alaric found he cared little for such opinions, having learned firsthand the emptiness of a life built around impressing people who valued title over character. 2 years after their wedding, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Margaret, after the elderly washerwoman who had shown Eleanor such quiet dignity throughout her childhood, a woman who had passed away peacefully the previous winter, but whose memory Eleanor wished to honor permanently within her own family. Cecilia, by then formally engaged to Edward Lowry, was among the first to hold her niece, signing gentle words of welcome that the infant could not yet understand, but that Cecilia hoped, someday, little Margaret might learn to answer in kind. The story of how the Duke of Ashford had once hidden his identity to test a merchant's daughter's kindness became, over the years, a favorite tale told throughout Ashcombe and the surrounding villages, though it was rarely told with any bitterness toward the deception itself. Instead, it became a story about the quiet, unwitnessed choices that reveal a person's true character, about the courage required to be honest, even when honesty carries risk, and about a young woman who had once knelt beside an injured stranger in the rain, without asking a single question about who he was or what he could offer her in return. Eleanor herself, when asked occasionally by curious visitors whether she had forgiven the deception that marked the beginning of her marriage, would often smile and offer the same simple answer she had given her husband on the morning she chose to knock on his cottage door. I forgave the method once I understood the fear behind it, but more than that, I learned that even a lie built from fear could not hide a heart that was, underneath everything, sincerely searching for something true. That search, in the end, was worth the pain it cost us both to find. Alaric, listening nearby whenever his wife told this story, never failed to feel a quiet, humbled gratitude toward the woman who had shown him, through nothing more than her instinctive, unwavering kindness, that the world contained hearts large enough to love without condition, patient enough to communicate across silence without a single spoken word, and strong enough to forgive even the most carefully constructed deception when honesty finally arrived to take its place. And so the story of the Duke and the Merchant's Daughter settled into the quiet history of Ashcombe, remembered not for the disguise that began it, but for the honesty that ultimately saved it, a reminder passed down through generations that true kindness asks for nothing in return, and that love built on truth, however delayed, could grow stronger than any love built on convenient assumptions ever might have been.